No latecomers. So thank you all very much for coming out this evening. A bit wintry out there. I was saying even the flowers look wintry tonight. Anyway, it's very nice to see you all and to welcome Dr. Ian Friel, who's going to talk to us about the resolutions and pirates. However, first, I've got a few things to tell you about. Well, first thing is that the Museum and Art Gallery are now open on Sundays for the summer, and it closes again when the schools go back, and the exhibition finishes on the 3rd of September. So please do turn up on Sundays and make it our volunteers worthwhile. The current exhibition, The Pirates, runs all summer until the 3rd of September. Do come along. It's fact and, as well as the fiction of pirates, and certainly the families who've been so far have absolutely loved it. And there's a lot of dressing up as pirates for children, so do bring your children, grandchildren along, and they'll have a bit of fun. We're also starting our outreach programs, not only in Leamington for the children who have free school meals, but in the outlying villages as well. That's what we got our big grant for at the beginning of the year, and we're starting to roll that out this summer as well. So you'll see lots of activity, lots of children, and it'll be good fun. After that, in September, we're having an exhibition called Parallel Lives, which has been curated by our own much-loved Steve Marshall, together with Jill Clark, who he often works with. And it's an exhibition of 6 women artists who all lived in the same part of the 20th century. And it's about not only the art they produced, but the challenges they faced as women artists in some of our living memory. So Steve and Jill are coming to talk to us on the 1st of September about that exhibition, so you'll have a preview of it before it actually opens, which will be lovely. So that's the 1st of September. It's our next talk. We have a break in the summer, nothing in August, and the September one is 1st of September, usual time, usual place, and it'll be Steve and Jill talking about Parallel Lives. We also in September start the planning for next year for your talks. So if anybody has any suggestions or any ideas, please do let us know. Next year is the 25th anniversary of St. Barbe, so we'll be celebrating that over the summer. And then in the autumn, we're having an exhibition called Leamington Afloat, which celebrates the life of the river. So if anybody knows anybody who has interests in the river, we'd be very pleased to have them talk to us. And finally, for next year, another big event is our Open Gardens, which will be our 25th anniversary Open Gardens. So if anybody would like to open their garden, please let Jackie, who's sitting at the back, know. And we'd be very pleased to add you to our list. We always like to keep it fresh. So that is the parish notices. Ian Friel is going to talk to us about the pirates of the Resolutions, which I believe were a series of ships. And Ian is a very long-serving member of the Maritime Historical Fellowships, community. You've worked with the Mary Rose at the National Maritime Museum, and where else? Chichester, lots of local museums, lives locally in Chichester, and is a very welcome addition to our talks programme, and he is going to talk to us about pirates in the 17th century. Thank you, Ian.
Check that I think my mic's on. Everyone? Yep. Everyone hear me? Great. Thank you very much. It's the first time we've given a talk in Leamington, so thank you very much for asking me here, and also thank you for turning out on what's probably the least summery evening of the entire summer so far. talk, as Prue was saying, is about the Pirates of the Resolutions, which sounds a rather odd title. I'll tell you a bit more in detail in a moment, but the story was something I came across when I was researching one of these books. The idea behind the books was to chart a maritime history of Britain from the Middle Ages to the 21st century, but using stories of shipwrecks to act as waymarkers along the way, both well-known ones and some completely obscure. And I came across this story to do with the Resolution pirates, which involves 3 ships in total, one of which ended up being wrecked. We're all familiar with pirates, or at least with an idea of pirates. It may be that you're a fan of the Pirates of the Caribbean, and that Captain Jack Sparrow, interpreted by Johnny Depp, possibly channeling Keith Richards, represents your notion of what a pirate was. Alternatively, you may favour the "Arr, Jim lad" school of piracy, which derives from Robert Newton's portrayal of Long John Silver in the 1950 Disney version of Treasure Island. Apparently, the director instructed Newton to let it rip in the role, and let it rip he did. Incidentally, there is apparently it may come up in your exhibition, there is an international Talk Like a Pirate Day, which I think is sometime in September, so I think maybe the 19th, I should have checked, but anyway, that's by the by. A good deal of our modern caricature of pirates derives from Treasure Island, and certainly influenced these pirates who were seen coming ashore to conduct a raid at Cawsand in Cornwall in 2015. If you look closely, you'll see that one of them is actually wearing wellies, which are not totally historic, but there we go. As I say, most of our ideas, modern ideas of pirates, can be traced back to Treasure Island. But Robert Louis Stevenson didn't just make it up. He drew on a range of sources, much influenced by Captain Charles Johnson's bestseller, which was entitled A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, which was published in 1724. The book contains a series of potted biographies of famous pirates and set a sensationalist tone for the coverage of piracy that endures to this day, particularly as regards the so-called golden age of piracy. This golden age lasted, roughly speaking, from the mid-17th to the early 18th centuries. Calling it a golden age, of course, does raise some questions. For example, we don't speak of a golden age of mugging or burglary, do we? Anyway, piracy... Thank you. Piracy had been endemic in Europe since classical antiquity, and probably long before. In medieval and 16th century Europe, it wasn't at all unusual for the elites to be involved. You only have to think of Queen Elizabeth I and her courtiers sponsoring what were in effect pirate voyages. Francis Drake undertook some of these, and he can be seen as a pirate. This is actually, it's possibly an unfamiliar view of him, but it's a clay mould for the statue that now stands on Plymouth Hoe. It dates from the 19th century, and it must be about 8 feet tall. It's at Buckland Abbey if you want to see it. As I say, Francis Drake can be seen as a pirate. The Spanish certainly saw him as one, as well as being the devil incarnate. But for people like Drake, piracy could pay. Don't know if anyone's been to Buckland Abbey in Devon, which was bought by Drake in the late 16th century with the profits of his activities. However, going on into the 17th century, economic and social change, together with the growth of more effective state navies, started to push piracy more and more to the margins. In this case, those margins were the less well-controlled areas around the Caribbean and North America, although the pirates also ranged across the Atlantic to Africa and indeed into European waters sometimes. The Golden Age came to an end as European powers got a better grip on their overseas colonies. There's little doubt that poverty and fear of starvation drove many men to piracy. In 1618, the English seaman Sir Henry Mainwaring, who was himself a pardoned former pirate, wrote that piracy flourished because the common sort of seamen are so generally necessitous and discontented. The story I'm going to tell you this evening is typical in many ways of the behaviour of pirates in this golden age. The account is based on the testimonies of 6 men and 1 teenager, all of them pirates, and concerns a pirate voyage that took place in 1683 and 1684. The voyage involved 3 ships, one after another, each successively named Resolution. During this time, the crew had 4 captains. The story is contained in the High Court of Admiralty's record of the interrogations of the pirates, and I'll be quoting phrases that seem to be versions of the men's actual speech. You'll hear words like pistol, and pieces of 8 this evening, but please don't imagine that this means that these men and boys were merely cardboard characters. The name Resolution suggested strength of purpose, though the term may have reflected the kind of quasi-democratic debates by which pirates arrived at major decisions. And this whiff of democracy was one of the things that made pirates so terrifying to 17th century governments. So, let's have a look at our 7 characters. In 1684, the 7 pirates and their approximate ages were as follows. Firstly, there was Robert Dangerfield, who was aged about 32, probably of English origin. John Strangwich, a very unusual name, but English in origin, who was a teenager, born in about 1669 in a place called Piscataway, which is now in New Jersey in the USA, a new town that had only been founded about 3 years before he was born. Then there was Joshua Bloodworth, aged about 19, who was born in Chesterfield in Derbyshire, about as far away from the sea as it's possible to get in England. Then we have John Guestford, who was a Londoner, born in Petticoat Lane. George Boogins, a rather mysterious character, aged about 36, who came from Rendsburg, now in Germany, but then in the dominion of the Elector of Brandenburg. Accounts of how Boogins came to be in the West Indies differ, but both he and Guestford seem to have gone into piracy after being abandoned ashore. Then we have George Bougie, I think that's how his name was pronounced, whose origin is unknown, aged 26, and John Lewis, who was possibly English or Welsh, aged 27. Boogins and Guestford later claimed they were ill for most of the voyage, didn't know what was going on, a kind of sort of dog-ate-my-homework defence, which didn't really work. And Bougie and Lewis said very little. However, the other 3 testimonies are very detailed, and they broadly corroborate each other, despite the fact that Dangerfield was quizzed in America, and the other 2 were interrogated in London. And I think we can believe them, because in the course of what they said, these men actually incriminated themselves. No real doubt about it, I would have thought, but we'll see how they got on with that. Possibly they were hoping that being honest would lead to mercy. Strangwich, of course, was the subject of Charles II of England. British America was still less than 80 years old at this date, and American independence was nearly a century off, so it's a very, very different world we're talking about. When we think of British pirate ships of this time, we don't normally think of them as being crewed by people with foreign accents. But besides Boogins, the Resolution pirate crew also later included a significant number of Frenchmen and French boys, a Greek, and a man described as a Dutch Negro. And you can see this with other crews. In 1684, a list was made of the crew of a French pirate ship called the Trompeurs, which an English document said included French, Scotch, Dutch, English, Spaniards, Portugals, Negroes, Indians, mulattoes, Swedes, Irish, Jerseymen, and New Englanders. So they were pretty diverse, I think. The story of the Resolution pirates, so far as we know it, starts with Robert Dangerfield. According to his testimony, he embarked on the pirate life in January or February 1683, when he joined a very small 26-ton vessel called the Resolution. Its type was known as a bark, which denoted a small sailing ship. This vessel was under the command of a man named Jeremy Revell, and the ship turned up at Point Negril in Jamaica. It's just up there. The bark had been captured recently from the Spanish, and Captain Ravel was planning what he described as a voyage of purchase upon the Spaniards. Purchase in this case meant pillage or plunder. 35 men answered Ravel's call, which must have made the tiny ship very crowded. It was probably no more than about 50 feet or 15 meters in length. The vessel left Jamaica and headed to another island to recruit a doctor, a ship's surgeon, before sailing to the Isle of Roatan. The bark was detained at Roatan for a couple of weeks, but eventually made off for what Dangerfield called the Bay of Andorras, probably meaning Honduras. It was at this point that the crew went through its first major bust-up and its first change of captain. Captain Jeremy Ravel wanted to sail for Campeche Bay in Mexico. He was supported by 3 other sailors, but the rest of the crew wanted to go to the Guinea coast in West Africa. The opposition was headed by the new doctor, who was called John Graham, and the ship's master, John Wright. Ravel and his supporters lost the argument. They didn't have to walk the plank, there's none of that in this story, but he and the men who supported him were put ashore on a desert island. And there's I think it's an early 18th century image of Robinson Crusoe, which is relevant perhaps. The place was uninhabited, it was certainly desert, and some 10 leagues, that's 30 miles or 48 kilometers from the mainland or any populated place. It wasn't quite as brutal as it sounds, though, because the men were left with a turtle net for catching food, their firearms, and a canoe. The crew of the Resolution now chose Dr. Graham as their new commander, and he probably became one of the few medical men ever to have made it to the level of pirate chief. I don't know if we've got any doctors in the audience, but if you're thinking of a new career, take heart. The ship, despite what the crew had wanted, didn't head directly to Africa, and I think this speaks to Dr. Graham's powers of persuasion. Instead, it headed north. It made a brief stop at Point Comfort in modern Virginia, and then carried on. Soon after, the Resolution encountered a New York ketch about 60 miles off the coast of Virginia. A ketch was a small trading or fishing vessel, and this one was on a return voyage from Barbados to Delaware. Captain Graham hailed it, and this is what he's supposed to have said, asking if there were any young men on board the said ketch who were willing to go with him to seek their fortunes. This phrase, seek their fortunes, it comes up again in at least one of the other testimonies, and it sounds like something out of Treasure Island, but it was real. 3 of the ketch's crew answered his call, including a young man called John Strangit, or Strangwich. It wasn't just the lure of riches that attracted them. Strangwich later said that he and his shipmates were afraid that the ketch was running low on food and drink. Once on board the Resolution, the new recruits were informed that the bark had come from privateering in the West Indies. Privateering was a system whereby a state licensed ships to attack and take the shipping of enemy nations. They were given what was sometimes called letters of reprisal or a letter of marque to allow them to do so. And Graham told these new arrivals that the Resolution had a legal privateering commission granted by the French authorities in the Caribbean. There was apparently a French document of some sort on board, but I'm pretty sure that the commission itself was a complete lie. The little bark headed north again. After another brief stopover on an island off the coast of Maine, it made for Nova Scotia. The pirates probably expected easy pickings among the fishing and trading vessels there, and they certainly found them. 5 small French vessels called shallops were taken. But then the rows started. A pirate captain had a level of job security roughly on a par with that of a modern Premier League football manager. Pirate crews lacked the chain of command normally found on a contemporary merchant ship or naval vessel. This is a late 17th century Dutch view of a sailor who's obviously half seas over, so to speak. Gives you an idea of how these guys were dressed. And it was, this is a fairly typical view of how sailors were seen by those on shore. Many pirates were former sailors and had very likely experienced harsh discipline before in ships where the captain's will was paramount. Pirate craft had men to perform the functions of captain, master, mate, boatswain, and so on, but these would only serve by consent of their shipmates. Professional ability, charisma, or personal brutality, or combinations of all three, might help to keep a man in post. So could success in providing a continuous flow of booty. That was a good key to popularity, but sometimes not even that was enough. The Nova Scotia shallops were looted of valuable cargoes of moose and beaver skins, enough to give each pirate a dozen, though it seems that the men were not content. Perhaps a load of old animal skins didn't seem quite the thing when they'd been envisaging gold and goodness knows what in Africa. We don't know the reason, but Captain Graham now fell out with the ship's master, John Wright. And as Dangerfield said, most of the company taking Wright's part. Graham and 8 or 9 others left the Resolution and boarded one of the shallops, in this case, as it said, to seek their fortunes. The crew of the bark, meanwhile, chose Joseph Anderson, the former quartermaster, as their leader. Once Graham was gone, the bark finally set sail for Africa, because West Africa was known as a source of great riches, such as gold, ivory, and of course, slaves. Where they turned up was the Cape Verde Islands group, which lies off modern Mauritania and Senegal. The ship made landfall on the island of Mayo, which is just up there. Captain Anderson, along with the rest of the crew, including Guestford and Boogans, went ashore. Mayo had been colonised by the Portuguese, an ally of Britain, but this didn't stop the pirates from attacking the place. 20 or more men landed at evening some distance from the main settlement, marched all night, and mounted a surprise attack the next morning. They fired on the inhabitants, who fled, along with the local governor. And governor sounds quite grand. He was probably just a local headman, really. The pirates plundered the town of, as Dangerfield said, clothes, plate, meaning silver, and money. And they captured 3 African people, a man, a woman, and a child. These were let go a couple of days later when the governor and some Portuguese men came down to negotiate. The crew demanded a supply of beef and took the Portuguese hostage until it was produced. The governor managed to escape, but eventually the beef was forthcoming and the hostages were set free. The pirates returned to the Resolution to find another vessel anchored nearby. Yep. Sorry. This was a 100-ton Pink, which was basically a 3-masted sailing ship, quite a small one, and known as a Pink because it was identifiable by its distinctive pinched-in stern. The Pink was commanded by a man called Thomas Scudder, had a crew of 14, roughly half of them French, and the vessel had come from the Grand Banks off Newfoundland. The Pink's crew now agreed to sail along with the Resolution. The Resolution and the Pink set off for another of the Cape Verdes, Boa Vista. The pirates looted that as well, repeating the tactics of a night march and surprise attack. The usual haul of plate, money, clothes, etc. was supplemented by 2 captives, the local governor and a Catholic friar. 100 pieces of 8 were demanded in ransom and subsequently paid. And pieces of 8 were coins worth 8 reales in Spain, and these are pieces of 8. They're a bit knackered, but they came from an 18th century Dutch shipwreck. They were silver coins, probably produced in the mines that the Spanish had in Mexico, and were a common currency in the Atlantic, not just in Spain. The pirates carried on to another small island nearby, named Barbe, which is there. The settlement there was captured, along with its governor. Dangerfield said that they rifled the island, but could not find anything of value. The local population had run for the hills, but somehow the pirates were still able to compel them to supply around 25 hogs for the ship's store. I don't think this means that they were stuffing live pigs into the ship's hold. This would have been salted pork for them to eat. The Pink underwent maintenance here. It was careened, which was a system whereby a ship was pulled over onto its side, exposing the underwater hull on one side, so all the growths could be cleaned off, because they would make the ship go slower, and then it would be turned over onto the other side. After this had happened, the two ships' companies agreed to join together, and they chose Joseph Anderson as their joint captain. The bark was broken up and burnt, and the Pink was now named Resolution. With a total crew now numbering 42 men and 6 boys, the pirates set off for the African coast. They arrived at an English factory, which must have been James Fort, one of the fortified trading settlements maintained by the Royal African Company, which had been established in 1661. And that's up there. English trade with West Africa began in the 16th century. And since 1618, much of the British commerce with the area had been run by some kind of monopoly organisation. The Royal African Company was the latest incarnation of this, gaining a definitive charter in 1663. And this is quite literally a fragment of the Royal African Company. It's a large part of what was known as a Guinea Jack. It was a flag carried by the Royal African Company ships. And this is supposed to have been captured by a Dutch ship in 1665, so it's nearly contemporary with the pirates I'm talking about. It was gold that first drew the British to West Africa. But apart from an abortive slaving operation by John Hawkins in the 1560s, it wasn't until the 1640s that the British began to figure significantly in the slave trade. This was caused by a growing demand for labour on British plantations in the West Indies. And slaving, it must be said, was the main business of the Royal African Company. In law, the company had sole rights to this in Britain, but it didn't prevent others, who were called interlopers, from carrying slaves across the Atlantic for their own profit. When the Resolution arrived at James Fort, the governor there must have guessed immediately what sort of ship it was, but he had a bigger worry. There was a large, well-armed French ship in the area, no doubt ready to prey on the company's trade. And this is one of a number of wonderful 17th century Dutch engravings of ships. And it shows a Dutch ship that was used to trade with France, which is relevant to this vessel. The governor received the Resolution's crew amicably and clearly hoped that the pirates would do something about the French vessel, which was reckoned to be a Dutch-built frigate, a bit like this thing, of about 250 tons burden. It was 2.5 times the tonnage of the Resolution and mounted some 16 guns to the Pink's 4. However, the French ship was reported to be weakly manned with between 20 and 30 men, so the pirates outnumbered them. The Resolution sailed off to look for the French ship and found it after a 3-day search. There was a brief battle. The French opened fire first, killing 2 pirates. The pirates boarded the Frenchmen, wounded 2 of the crew, and took the ship. The victory was made all the easier because the French captain had gone ashore in order to trade. Most of the French crew were allowed to leave the ship in one of its boats. Only 3 decided to stay with the pirates: a French boy, a Greek man, and the French doctor, the Resolution's own surgeon being ill, presumably the surgeon had been part of the Pink's original crew. Let's give you a sense of what these ships were like. This is a ship being careened, and it gives us a rare view of the deck of one of these things, a vessel of probably roughly similar size to the one that the pirates had captured. And even though it was, relatively speaking, a big ship for the period, it does give a sense of quite how confined the wooden world of sailors of the time and much later actually was. When Strangwich was interrogated, he said that the French ship had a mixed cargo of linen, 2 or 3 lockers of beads, 50 to 60 tons of brandy, and 40 to 50 tons of iron. And these are all the kinds of goods that were used to buy slaves in Africa. Callously, Strangwich added that there were some few other things and about 15 or 16 Negroes. Just as piracy went with war, it also went with the slave trade. Anderson and his crew decided to keep the French ship and gave the pink to the Royal African Company governor in regard he was so kind to them. A barrel of brandy was also given as a gift, but the Africans were sold to the governor in order to raise some cash to buy provisions. Anderson and his men then ranged along the coast of Guinea, West Africa, in their new ship, the third and last Resolution of this pirate voyage. The Resolution sailed on to Takoradi, there, which is also known as Secondi, where both the Dutch and the English had forts and slaving stations. There are two forts actually either side of the river there. Just before Christmas 1683, 4 new sailors joined the crew of the Resolution. They included Joshua Bloodworth, who was aged about 18 at this time. Bloodworth had come to Africa in a small London ship that was on a slaving mission. The ship's master had sold some of the victuals, and Bloodworth and his shipmates, a bit like Strangwich earlier, were afraid they might go hungry. A couple of pirates came aboard the slaver, probably at Takoradi, and they persuaded Bloodworth and his mates to jump ship. Bloodworth later said that he'd also been sold the line about the Resolution's French letter of marque and believed it, only to discover the ship's true nature when he was aboard and couldn't escape. The Resolution carried on its cruise along the Guinea coast, calling it what Dangerfield called Akara, which is Accra in Ghana, just up there, and then made for a small Portuguese-ruled island called Ilha do Príncipe. As before, the pirates had no scruples about pillage. Dangerfield mentions in his interrogation that we wounded the local governor, though Strangwich said that Dangerfield himself did it with a blow from a musket. The governor was taken prisoner and forced to ransom himself with what were described as several hogs. There was a Portuguese ship in harbour which Captain Anderson ordered to be burned to prevent any pursuit. The pirate ship now headed back to the mainland, taking 4 kidnapped Africans with them. The ship was careened on an uninhabited island in the Gabon River, where the crew collected a store of wood and water. They were constantly having to do this, running out of water, but the wood, of course, was used for the ship's oven in the hold. They came across a small London merchantman in the Gabon River and gave the master a stock of iron beads, knives, and brandy to use as trade goods upriver to buy food for them. However, while they were at the island, there was yet another scene of violence, this time between 2 of the pirates. I don't know if anyone's ever sailed on a small sailing ship for any length of time, but tensions can build easily in the close confines of a ship. And there was some kind of disagreement between John Guessford and another man called John Bell. Eventually, according to Guessford, Bell said that he would kill him manfully or cowardly, meaning the choice between a duel or a knife in the back. The 2 went ashore and fought it out with pistols. Guessford was the better marksman and shot the said Bell in the belly. The man was ferried back to the ship but died of his wounds the next day. This part of the story ended on an odd note. Dangerfield said that the dying Bell called Guessford to him and said, "I am a dead man. You have killed me. I do forgive you for it." Guessford, in return, said he was sorry for doing it. Forgiveness and contrition may seem oddly out of place in this tale of violence and slave trading, but it's a reminder that these were real human beings. And we've got two of the pirates testified to this thing actually happening. Guessford admitted to having killed Bell in a duel, but oddly enough, he didn't mention about being forgiven. Maybe he was just ashamed of it. I don't know. The Resolution took 4 sailors from the London ship, which had gone upriver, to join their crew. And they also recruited 1 Dutch Negro with his own consent, meaning that he was a free man, not a slave. The testimonies disagree about the direction of sail the ship took then, but the most likely sequence of events is that they first went to Cape Lopez to take on wood, sailed out to a couple of the islands, and then returned to Cape Lopez, which is there. Thomas Scudder, who had been master of the Pink and was now Resolution's quartermaster, went ashore to trade there, but some Africans stole iron and beads from him. In revenge, at least 18 Africans were taken captive. Blubworth says they were lured aboard the Resolution with the promise of brandy. The Resolution's captain, Joseph Anderson, bartered with the captain of another English ship at Cape Lopez, acquiring a store of 50 hogs, they really did like their salted pork, in return for a barrel of brandy and some iron bars. At this point, the Resolution's internal conflicts once again bubbled to the surface, possibly precipitated in some way by the bartering. Anderson fell out with the sailing master, John Wright, and ended up leaving the Resolution, along with around 5 crewmen. Wright was chosen as new captain by those who remained. Blubworth claimed that he'd wanted to go with Anderson, but that Wright had threatened to shoot him if he tried it. 8 of the slaves were sold to the other English ship, and the Resolution, when it was off to sea again, and put in at Anaboa, or Annabon Island, to buy provisions, which is just down there. They stayed there for 3 or 4 days and then headed out to sea once again. But this was always a problem with sailing ships. They ran into contrary winds, which drove them back to Annabon. For some reason, the Resolution doesn't seem to have had any small boats left at this stage, and a man was sent ashore, presumably he swam there, walking not really being an option, to ask for the ship to be allowed to fill its water barrels. According to Dangerfield, the Portuguese there replied that they could not do this unless we fought for it, though he also admitted at the same time they sold the pirate who had gone ashore a small canoe so he could get back to his ship. This doesn't actually add up, and it may be that Dangerfield was trying to offer a justification for what happened next. With good reason, the inhabitants of the island were terrified of pirates, and they went so far, as Dangerfield said, they burnt their own town, leaving only the church standing. It was a kind of scorched earth tactic, probably intending to make the pirates think there was nothing left to steal. It didn't work. Captain Wright went ashore with around 15 men, looking for loot. The men included Thomas Scudder, and for some reason, possibly he was an aggrieved Protestant, and this was a Catholic church, Thomas Scudder set the church alight, so there would have been nothing left of the settlement. The pirates boarded their ship again and set sail. 14 days out from Annabon, they spotted a 250-ton vessel behind them. It proved to be Dutch. The Resolution hove to, that is, came to a halt, and allowed the other ship to come up under its stern. The pirates hailed the Dutchmen. The Dutch captain asked where they were from, and the pirates answered Pete Guaves, meaning Petit Goave, which was a notorious French privateering port on the island of Haiti. The Dutchman, who clearly knew what he was about, shouted back an order for the Resolution to send its boat to him. The pirates could not do this as they had no boat. The Dutch captain clearly took this as a refusal to yield. His ship then, as Dangerfield said, shot ahead of us and fired chase guns at us, wounding one of the crew. The Resolution was flying English colours at first, but hauled them down and raised French ones, when we intended to fire, as Dangerfield said. Well, changing your colours like that, I mean, it's next best thing to actually getting someone to go out on the side of the ship and paint, this is a pirate ship. You know, it was pretty obvious. The crew of the Resolution resolved to attack her and take her. The pirate ship filled its sails and gave chase, fired 2 or 3 times, then tried to board the enemy. They failed. The Resolution's boatswain was wounded and fell back on his own ship. The pirate ship gave its adversary 2 broadsides, getting 3 in return. 2 pirates were killed and 5 or 6 wounded, and as Dangerfield said, 2 of them losing each 1 leg. The battle lasted 2 or 3 hours. The Resolution's crew finally boarded the ship 3 times, but they couldn't take it, and in the end, the Dutchman escaped. The action probably took place somewhere in the Western Atlantic, because soon afterwards, the pirates met with an English ketch on its way from Carolina to Barbados, about 290 miles off the American coast. And at this point, 6 young French fellows or boys were sent over to the ketch, probably to get them out of the way and to stop them from telling other people that the Resolution was not a French privateer. Certainly Dangerfield and Bloodworth agreed that they were put off the pirate ship, as they put it, for fear they might tell tales and make discovery. With British-controlled waters so close, Wright and the other pirates must have been getting nervous. The pirate ship carried on its way. As the Carolina coast was sighted, the Resolution met with a small New England vessel and purchased a lot of provisions and liquors, paying in gold that had been acquired by piracy, looting, or slave trading. The 2 vessels stayed together for about a day, and then the Resolution made for the coast of Carolina. The wind blowing violent and contrary, the ship was forced to anchor off St. Helena Island. It was just off the coast of South Carolina, just south of Charleston, on the 31st of August, 1684. Unluckily for the crew, this was on a falling tide. About an hour later, the weather got worse and drove the Resolution onto a reef of sand. The sailors cut away their mainmast in an effort to save the ship, but the position was hopeless. Some of the crew made rafts and got to shore, whilst others, John Strangwich included, actually swam to safety. Up to 15 men drowned, though both whites and Africans, though over 30 whites and a dozen or more Africans survived. Just to put this in context, this is a Dutch chart from the 17th century of the coast of the Carolinas. St. Helena Island is up there, and Charlestown is there. You may notice well, it wasn't really a deliberate mistake, it's just the way the chart is drawn. It's actually upside down. North is at the bottom. It's just a quirk of this particular chart maker. But it gives you a sense of where they were. Some of the shipwrecked pirates sought shelter with a Native American tribe, and as Dangerfield said, at the house of Wyner, an Indian who had formerly been in England, who presumably spoke English. But word of the shipwrecked pirates soon reached the authorities in Charleston, because the house of Wyner was where Dangerfield and 11 of his shipmates were captured. Bloodworth and Lewis were picked up about 12 days later at what was described as the house of Madame Pettit in Charleston. I don't think this was local tea rooms, it's almost certainly a whorehouse. They had on them a serge coat, some old Dutch breeches, a pair of drawers, 4 guns, and gold and silver on them, worth about £40. This was the equivalent at the time of about 16 or 17 months' pay for an ordinary sailor in the Royal Navy, so not huge riches. Dangerfield and Bougie were interrogated in Berkeley County in South Carolina in late September 1684. They may have been hanged, but their actual fates are unknown. 5 of the pirates, that's Strangwich, Bloodworth, Guestford, Boogins and John Lewis, were sent to England, though Lewis died before the High Court of Admiralty could interrogate him. They were sent with covering letters from Sir Peter Collington, who was governor of Carolina and was convinced of their guilt and wanted to see them executed. It seems bizarre, perhaps, that these pirates should be shipped so far away to face justice, but pirate trials, with their often deadly outcomes, were intended to have a deterrent effect on other sailors who might consider piracy as a career option. The 4 surviving pirates were imprisoned in the Marshalsea prison. You can see here, this is what it looked like before it was rebuilt in the early 19th century. You may have come across the Marshalsea in Charles Dickens' Little Dorrit. where it's portrayed as a debtor's prison. But certainly in the 17th and 18th centuries, it was also used by the High Court of Admiralty to house its prisoners, pirates included. The Marshalsea itself was divided into two parts. There was the master's side for prisoners who could pay their way and was probably relatively comfortable, and I think this is almost certainly the master's side we can see there. It looks quite neat and people are bothering to wash their clothes and so on. And there was the common side, which was for people who couldn't pay their way, like pirates. I haven't been able to find a contemporary account of the Marshalsea from the 1680s, but there's a report from 1729 that was very critical and paints the common side as a true hellhole, where mistreatment and even torture were commonplace. In some rooms, hammocks had to be rigged so people could sleep. They were so crowded. And it was not unknown in hot weather for some of the prisoners to actually suffocate. If you want to get a sense of what the Marshalsea was like at this time, there's a great novel called The Devil in the Marshalsea. The name of the author escapes me at the moment, which gives an account of what it would have been like to be there. The four pirates endured the common side for months. They were interrogated eventually in July 1685, but their trial didn't finally take place until the 8th of January the following year. So basically they're banged up in this place for a long time. The Marshalsea stood in Suffolk. I don't think there's anything left of it now, but it's down here on the main road going up to London Bridge. Piracy was a felony, and these four men were facing the very real possibility of execution. The execution of condemned pirates had a very grim kind of ceremony about it. The sort of public hangings were commonplace, and those of pirates were in some ways particularly awful. They would have been taken up there, across London Bridge, and then round the Tower of London to Wapping, where there was the aptly named Execution Dock. I don't have a picture of Execution Dock itself, but this is a 17th century hanging scene. The gallows in Execution Dock were set up at the low tide mark. Hanging in this area was truly brutal. It didn't involve the sudden neck-breaking drop of more recent times. It was a process of slow strangulation. Once the men were dead, at least 3 tides would have to wash over their bodies before they were taken down. This whole thing sounds bizarre, almost pagan, but it underlined the fact that they died for crimes committed within the maritime jurisdiction of the Lord High Admiral, who wasn't just a naval commander, had an important legal function as well. After they were dead, pirates' bodies sometimes went for dissection, though others were tarred and displayed in chains, a warning to all passing sailors of the awful penalty there was for sea robbery. So this is what the Resolution pirates were facing. But it wasn't their fate. Guestford and Bougins were the only ones who faced concrete charges for taking the French and Portuguese ships. And Guestford was also charged with taking one of the fishing shallops in Nova Scotia. But Strangwich and Bloodworth were indicted on suspicion of piracy, but they were cleared. And Bougins too was acquitted. The only one to suffer a potentially grim fate was John Guestford. The verdict on him was that he is attainted of several felonies and piracies and must be hanged by the neck until he be dead. Guestford went on to endure another 6 months in the Marshalsea. In July 1686, he sent a pitiful petition to the Chief Justice of the High Court of Admiralty. And amongst other things, he wrote this: "Your worship's poor petitioner had lain confined 22 months, having no money nor friends to help myself. Withal, I do here lie like to perish in this Marshalsea prison." He asked for a royal pardon, and extraordinarily, he got it. On the 17th of July, he was set free. And that is all that we know directly of the Resolution pirates. This strange story of 3 ships and 4 captains is pretty typical of the pirates' world in the 17th and 18th centuries. Amongst other things, it gives you a jolt to think that the real counterparts of jolly old Captain Jack Sparrow and Long John Silver would have been enmeshed in the slave trade, just as the Resolution pirates were. Also typical were the forces that drove at least some of the Resolution pirates to a life of sea roving. The lure of loot and easy pickings certainly played a part, but both Strangwich and Bloodworth also testified that fear of hunger drove them to join the Resolution. Destitution probably also led Guestford and Boogans in the same direction, and once they were freed, they probably all went back to it. So, in the end, what did the Resolution pirates get out of it? Not a lot, probably. Money, goods, and enslaved people had to be repeatedly sold just to provide provisions. It wasn't a tale of chests overflowing with doubloons for them. With their hauls of skins, hogs, old clothes, and trinkets, the voyages of the ships called Resolution were a bit more like subsistent piracy than anything else. In contemporary 17th and 18th century writings, pirates acquired a kind of glamour, sparking an interest in tales of piracy that have endured until this day. The reality itself could be sadder, grimmer, and far less heroic than the storybooks suggest, and tainted with involvement in the slave trade. But nor were all pirates murderous psychopaths. The Resolution pirates were slavers and kidnappers, it's true. But they could be very violent. But they also let captives go, and John Guestford's regret at killing John Bell seems to have been genuine. Centuries on, the crimes of the pirates in the golden age of piracy seem to almost pale beside the acts committed by the nation-states that eventually hunted them down. Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and other nations all used their sea power to invade and colonize the wider world and to facilitate the transatlantic slave trade that took millions of Africans to the Americas. In the end, I suppose, thinking about the Resolution pirates is who were the biggest pirates? Thank you.
Questions for Ian? Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you. I see a lot of your illustrations came from the Rakes Museum. They were examples of what the boats looked like, not the actual Resolution.
There are no illustrations, as far as I know, that relate to the Resolution pirates. It wasn't even a particularly well-known story. You do get some surviving contemporary broadsides, these things that were sort of sheets, really, that were published and just sold in the streets, that retold stories of notorious highwaymen, pirates, and so on. But the Resolution pirates seem to have passed almost unnoticed.
That they're not from Greenwich or the National, Maritime Museum houses. The Rakes have got all these interesting either woodcuts or etchings. I wasn't quite sure.
They have a very open policy with their use, which is incredible, really. They have a thing called the Rijksstudio, which you can go on and you can download images and use for your own creative purposes, which is wonderful. But the reason I was using so many Dutch ones is because there are many more Dutch maritime paintings and engravings from the 17th century than there are English ones. And to be honest, they're easier to find. and given that seafaring was, there were national differences sometimes between types of ships and obviously dress and so on, but seafaring was pretty international. I mean, sailors moved around a lot. There were a floating population in more than one sense, and highly mobile by the nature of their job. So the Dutch illustrations are very, very helpful in that regard, and often actually the Dutch engravers are a great deal better than their English counterparts.
Anything else?
Thank you. I've been reading recently a very interesting book called The Bountiful Sea, and in it they talk about the Portuguese from somewhere around about 1495, 97, coming down to the Cape Verde Islands and establishing a base there to trade into mainland Africa for gold and for slaves. But at that stage, the slaves then were being taken up to Madeira and the Canary Isles to work there for sugar and even into mainland Europe, even before they then subsequently were taken out to the Caribbean, where again the Portuguese and later the Spaniards were trying to find a place for them.
Yes, I mean it was the Portuguese and the Spanish who started the transatlantic slave trade, but the British went on to dominate it. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that it's reckoned about 7 million Africans in total between the 16th century and the 19th were taken across the Atlantic as slaves, and of those, about half were carried by British ships. It's really quite staggering. I mean, the British they had the naval power eventually to defend the sea lanes and so on. And if anyone's interested to have a look at one of the books, one of the chapters, I've got one of the later ones, is based on the log of a British slave ship from 1806, the year before the slave trade was abolished in Britain, and it shows that the whole thing was still working just the same way it had just before it ended, at least for the British. It was odd actually looking at when I was working on this log after having worked on the stories of the Resolution pirates, coming across the same place names in Africa again and again that were still featuring in the slave trade. I mean, the Resolution pirates, I wish I'd been able to find out more about them. I did find a reference to a London waterman called John Strangwich, who died in about 1719, and I suppose it's conceivable he might have been the same John Strangwich who was tried as a pirate, but I couldn't find anything to say that it was the same person. Indeed, if you've been acquitted of being a pirate, the last thing I think you want to go around doing is talking about it. Sometimes you find if people ended up committing crimes later and were about to be hung, they would have they would retell their life story before they went to the scaffold, and occasionally you can pick up stories of people having been pirates there, but what happened to these men we don't know. I mean, they may well have changed their names. Wasn't at all uncommon to find people described as Smith alias Jones or something of that sort. So I'm sure if they ended up having normal lives, the last thing they'd want anyone to know is what they've been doing between 1683 and 1685. But it's an interesting story. It took me quite some while to pull it all together. And if you, it's well worth thinking about. If any of you are interested in doing a bit of further research, you can get a ticket to the National Archives at Kew and go and look at all these things. And there's the most amazing material in the High Court of Admiralty records, not just pirate interrogations, but stories of ordinary voyages. I even found one time a letter that a dying sailor wrote to his wife in London in the late 17th century, accusing a particular man of having killed him. You do find the most amazing stuff. And it's being opened up more by researchers at the moment, but there's still an awful lot more to be learned. I don't know how many meters of shelf in the archives are devoted to the High Court of Admiralty records, but it must be very, very large because they start in the early 1500s and run on to the 20th century. So that's a lot of ships and activity and all kinds of things, and amazing stories like that one. Sorry. Excuse me, I'll just have a quick drink of water.
Did the pirate ships have difficulty in getting the right sort of crew? Because presumably navigating across the Atlantic is something that you need to know a little bit about.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, they certainly had professional sailors on board who, as you say, knew how to navigate, because getting from Nova Scotia to the Cape Verdes is not the easiest of things. I think professional experience certainly helped with people becoming the ship's master or the ship's pilot, the navigator, and so on. So I think they definitely had people aboard who knew how to run a ship and how to navigate and so on.
They actually sort of recruited.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. You can imagine a job interview for a pirate. No, I think they would get anyone, because in the end, if you, as long as they weren't all going to die of starvation, the more crew a pirate ship had, the better it was to sail a ship, because sailing ships are incredibly labour intensive. Just hauling up the mainsail required a lot of men. And if it's a pirate ship, one of the things you were doing almost certainly was fighting other people, either these raids on shore or fighting other ships, and you needed to have significant manpower for that. I mean, none of the interrogations mention what happened to the pirates in the final battle who ended up losing a leg. I mean, they probably went down with the ship in the end, but it does bring home that reading these accounts, a lot of the cliches of the pirate storybooks, like seeking your fortunes or pieces of 8, don't actually mention any parrots, but they might well have had some. Exotic birds were certainly traded around by these ships. Although a lot of these things were true. And it's actually worth rereading books like Treasure Island. I reread it a while ago, not having looked at it since I was a kid. And Robert Louis Stevenson, although it's a story and he's hyped it up in many ways, it was firmly founded on fact. And given that Stevenson's family background was in the building and maintenance of lighthouses, he knew a lot about sailing ships. So he knew whereof he spoke. And it just required his powerful imagination to turn that sort of experience and the evidence he was finding in things like Captain Johnson's book to turn it into an extraordinary story, which still, I think, works incredibly well. Oh, by the way, that book about the devil in the Marshalsea, it's Antonia Hodgson. It's a great read. It's the first of a series about a particular character, and his first one, he ends up in the Marshalsea. It's a really good read. Oh, sorry.
Oh.
The gods.
I was interested in what you were saying about several times governors seem to have been taken hostage and had to buy themselves, and it was a few hogs or this and that and the other. It sounded almost as if this just went with the territory and that they were negotiating rather than this being a horrific once in a generation event. It was just
well,
lots of hardships going around.
Yeah, and living.
Is that a true sense of what it was?
I think that's probably true. Yeah, I mean, the living on a small island off the coast of Africa in that period, you were likely to be vulnerable to attacks because.
So they were ready to bargain in ways.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the Resolution pirates. I mean, we're relying on their testimony, but I think if they'd actually started wiping out villages and things of that sort, at least someone would have mentioned it. But it was more a case of, we take you hostage, give us some hogs. God knows what their digestive systems were like. And that was it. It was I don't know, I was trying to think of an equivalent. It was somewhat more matter of fact. I'm sure it wasn't to the people who suddenly saw pirates turning up at their village or pirate ship coming close to the shore, because quite often the people do seem to have run for the hills.
It doesn't say there's no accounts
I must admit, I haven't looked at the Portuguese sources, so I couldn't confirm this. But a lot of these governors, I think governor is probably a cursory title. I suspect these were fairly small settlements, and maybe a few hundred people with one guy in charge who could read and write or something, and he had the courtesy title of governor, because these were very, very small places. But it's interesting to contemplate. There's a kind of almost matter-of-factness about it in some respects that, if it was a Hollywood film, it would be quite different. There'd be lots of cliffhangers and, bodies strewn everywhere. Whereas in reality, it was, there was violence and the fear of violence, and those poor people on Annabon had their village, burned their village down rather than leave it to the pirates. So it does give some sense of the terror there was, which I'm sure was real. But it's the difference between story and what actually happens, as far as we can make out. Oh, sorry.
You mentioned about the fraudulent privateering certificate.
Mm.
I was thinking about privateering. So, if you were a privateer, then presumably there were certain no-go areas.
Oh, yeah.
But if you didn't have a privateering certificate, presumably anything goes. So, so you weren't constrained. You weren't constrained by any sort of state loyalties there, because you didn't have any semi-formal license, which implicitly dictated where you could go and where you couldn't.
Oh yes, I mean, if you went attacking merchant ships and you didn't have a privateering license, you were a pirate. There's no two ways about it. And privateering, it's a lot of the time it could shade over from privateering into piracy, and sometimes it was a bit of a grey area. And there's a great story of from the late 16th century, the contemporaries of Drake, the Fenner family from. I come from Chichester, and the Fenners lived around Chichester, and they were important seafarers, and it was a number of brothers and at least one nephew, and one of the brothers and his nephew in the 1580s acquired a letter of marque from the pretender to the throne of Portugal. Because what had happened is in 1580, Spain had conquered Portugal and absorbed it for the next 60 years, and the exiled heir to the Portuguese throne came to England, and he was doling, presumably to make money, he was doling out these privateering certificates to people, but they weren't legal as far as the English were concerned. And these two Fenners went off with their ship. They had a ship called the Galleon Fenner, which was tiny, 120 tons, but very heavily armed, with a crew of 70. Incredible overcrowding as usual. And they went off capturing ships of different nationalities, which they certainly shouldn't have been doing. And unusually, when they came back to England, they were arrested. The ship was arrested. One of the nephew was let off, but Edward Fenner, one of the older brothers, was under a suspended sentence of piracy for the next 14 years. So it shows that even people of that sort of gentry standing could end up in that kind of situation.
Well, that's really interesting. All right, in saying then you could receive a letter of marque from a country that wasn't your country of origin. So did that mean that if you were caught by the navy of your native country, technically you had committed treason?
It would certainly be illegal, I think, yeah, because the taking foreign privateering commissions, treasonous to a degree. What the Fenners had done was that these privateering certificates weren't regarded as genuine by the English, and they were going out and attacking ships that belonged to nations that were not enemies of England. I mean, Spain wasn't, theoretically. In the 18 years that Elizabethan England and Spain were at war, no one ever declared war. We were not actually at war with Spain, we were fighting a long war with them, and they tried to invade, but that was different. But yeah, I mean, you had to have a genuine privateering commission from your own country. And privateering was incredibly widespread. Every seafaring nation used it. It was, I suppose in modern military terms, it was a force multiplier, because navies themselves were always restricted in size, and the more ships you had going out attacking the vessels of other nations, the better. And it's the sort of thing that goes back into the Middle Ages. I mean, they're very likely privateers based in Lymington, quite possibly also pirates. The Solent could be a pretty dangerous place for ships at times in the 16th century, and on the Isle of Wight there was even a sort of market centre for pirate goods that operated apparently quite well for quite some time. So it was all over the place, and sometimes you would get people who were privateers who sort of shaded over into piracy. There were some notorious pirates who were just pirates from beginning to end, but it was always a problem, privateering. You find this even back in the Middle Ages, that people would sometimes use privateering commissions as an excuse for doing this, that, and the other. And it didn't help that the whole thing dated back to this medieval idea of a law of reprisal. If, for example, your ship was attacked by a ship of another nation and was, your goods were taken or what have you, and if you couldn't get redress in the courts of that nation, the English government, or whatever foreign government it was, would grant you the right of reprisal to recoup your goods by attacking the shipping of another country. And of course it was, if you want to encourage piracy, that's a good way of going about it. So, and one of the odd things about the resolution pirates was this constant refrain: we've got this letter of marque. And it's almost at times you wonder if they couldn't quite believe themselves that they were really pirates. It's legal, really. Joshua Bloodworth, when he arrived on the ship and he was told about this French privateering letter of marque, something was read out to him in French, but he didn't speak French, so he didn't have a clue what it was. I mean, it could have been the 17th century equivalent of the Paris phone directory for all he knew. People, they would sometimes cling to this thin veneer of legality and at the same time doing fairly awful things.
That note, Ian, thank you very much indeed for a very lively, entertaining and interesting
I hope people found it interesting. Thank you very much for asking me.
So now you can go and see our exhibition with an awful lot more background, probably more than you would have even learnt in the exhibition, fact and fiction. See you again on the 1st of September. Have a good weekend and have a good summer. Thank you. Oh, and don't forget about Ian's book.
Thank you.
Sir, books, 3 of them, about shipwrecks and people and all sorts of good things, and Henry V's Navy.